All right, everybody, welcome back to class. We are now at module number 7. And if you have looked at the syllabus, then you know the reality that we are almost done. We only have 8 modules in this class. And so we have module number 7 for a couple of weeks, and then eating disorders and module number 8 for a couple of weeks, and you're going to be done and out of here and on your way for this class. I hope that you're doing well. It has been good to read your homework assignments. Y'all are doing awesome. You're doing well on the quizzes. I hope that you're learning quite a bit in this interesting class called Abnormal Behavior. Module number 7 brings us to the personality disorders. And I want to say a couple of things to you about the personality disorders before we kind of do a little summary here, a little mini lecture or two. The personality disorders are complicated and sometimes controversial for different reasons. I always talk about the personality disorders whenever I teach this class, whenever I have time to talk about them, because I think they're important. I think it's important for us to understand and to think about the different ways in which mental health conditions can affect people. And there are times when professors in a class like this may say, I'm not talking about those personality disorders because clinicians have different ideas even about these mental health conditions. But I think it's really important for us to be familiar with just a wide range of how mental health conditions can kind of affect people in their lives and just so that way you're prepared as you go into this field and as you work a little bit. Many years ago, I was in graduate school getting my master's degree in counseling. I was going to school up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I took a class like this, Abnormal Behavior. And I was introduced to the DSM-3 at that time. And I remember we talked about schizophrenia and eating disorders and mood disorders and anxiety disorders and all those different kinds, like we've done in this class. And I remember just enjoying learning about people and their struggles. And I've always been fascinated by psychology and human nature. And I was just getting into it. And we got to about this point in the class that we are in this semester. And I remember sitting in class one day and the professor started introducing personality disorders. And I had never heard of personality disorders at that point. I knew what personality was, but I really didn't know what personality disorders were. And I sat there as he did his introduction, and I have to be honest, I kind of had a hard time wrapping my mind around what was he talking about. He kept talking about how these were enduring, disruptive disorders that sort of oftentimes lay on top of a mental health, other mental health conditions or underneath. Bipolar disorder is kind of it's sort of the disorder on top, and then underneath is a deeper, kind of more enduring personality issue. And I didn't know what he meant by that. I was like, and so I was just kind of trying to wrap my brain around. And I remember he gave us a reading assignment out of the DSM-3. I read a little bit. I kind of got an idea, but I was still kind of wrestling with what exactly. I mean, I kind of understand what depression is. I understand what anxiety disorders are, eating disorders, and schizophrenia. What are these what are these personality disorders? I didn't have a point of reference. But the second or third day, we were talking about the personality disorders. The professor started talking about cluster A, B, and C, which we're going to talk about in this section of our class. He started talking about cluster A. And the very first personality we talked about was paranoid personality disorder. Paranoid personality disorder, which we're going to talk about here in this module as well too. Well, I knew what paranoia was because we had studied schizophrenia, but I didn't know what paranoid personality disorder was. And he began to describe that there's 10 different personality disorders in the DSM-5. That's the first one, basically. It's the first one listed. And he started to describe paranoid personality disorder. And the light bulb went off in my head. Here's what I mean by that. About 4 years earlier, I was in college getting my undergraduate degree in psychology. And one summer, instead of going home to my parents' home in the summertime, I stayed because I lived in Texas, but my parents were living in Arizona. I was going to school in Texas, but my family was in Arizona. So in the summertime, I would go home. But that year, I stayed in Texas on my college campus because I was working and I was going to summer school. So I moved out of my apartment. I had to, and lived temporarily for the summer in another apartment with some guys that I did not know. I found a roommate wanted little thing up on a bulletin board, which is how you used to find a roommate before the days of the internet, right? But some of you can identify back in the day. That's how we found roommates in college back in that day. So for about 6, 7, 8 weeks, I lived temporarily in a small apartment with 2 or 3 other guys, and I did not know these guys. There was a guy in that apartment. That apartment had a big bedroom downstairs, a single bedroom, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. And there was a guy one of my roommates, who had the single bedroom downstairs. And I guess you would call him a hermit. He was a different guy. I'm not being critical. He was a little odd. He never came out of his room. He kept the door locked. He never spoke to anyone. There was something odd about him, something different about him. It wasn't like social anxiety disorder. He wasn't like socially anxious. He was more like suspicious. Does that make sense? He was more like suspicious and kind of leery of people. And he would lock his door. You could not go into his bedroom. So he would lock it. He would come out. He would not make eye contact with anyone. He would leave for the day. He'd come back and go into his room. He'd lock the door. Um, I always got the impression, though, that when he was in his bedroom, because his bedroom was kind of near where the TV and the kitchen were in the apartment, which is where I was a lot of the time, I always had the impression that he was listening, like through the door. I just could tell. You ever had that sense that someone's listening? I could always tell that even though he was in his room, that he was like listening, like through the walls or through the doors at us, at what we were saying. We were just talking about normal, typical stuff. Um, I don't know what happened to that guy. I never saw him again after I moved out that summer, but he was a little odd. And I have to be honest, I kind of felt glad when I could go back to my old apartment. No offense. He was just a different dude. When my professor, 3 or 4 years later, started reviewing that personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, I thought that was that guy. I mean, every single symptom of paranoid personality disorder fit my ex roommate. And I thought to myself, sitting in graduate school, I didn't know there was a name for that. I didn't know. I just thought he was just kind of, I can be honest, I thought it was kind of weird. I thought it was kind of different because there was something unusual and odd about him. He didn't have autism. It wasn't autism spectrum disorder. It wasn't social anxiety. Didn't appear to be depression. He was just really different. And as I began to study paranoid personality disorder, I was like, oh, I get it. That's what a personality disorder is, like my ex roommate. A few days later in that class, we studied antisocial personality disorder. And I thought, oh, I know someone. I know someone kind of like that, right? Then we studied borderline personality disorder, maybe another class or two later. And I was like, oh, I get it. Oh, I know. Okay. And you may have that experience this semester too. As we study these personality disorders, there's an old saying that says the personality disorders are hard to describe, but they're easy to experience. If that makes sense, they're harder to describe. More easily experienced when you meet someone and you interact with someone who has some of the features of a personality disorder. You'll know it. I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that's just kind of how the personality disorders are. The personality disorders are often what we call plus disorders. And what that means is this: it means that oftentimes with a personality disorder is kind of an undercurrent, it's kind of an underlying condition. And on top of it, you might have anxiety. On top of it, you might have depression. On top of it, you might have eating disorders or PTSD or something. But underneath it, at the heart of the person, at the personality level, you have struggles, right? And so this idea that mental health conditions and personality disorders, kind of like people with sort of like we talked about with last module, many people who struggle with mental health conditions also abuse substances, and hence substance use disorders kind of becomes like a co-occurring, like two different things happening at one time: mental health and substance abuse. Personality disorders are kind of like that. Now they are mental health conditions. Personality disorders are, but kind of the idea are more like more traditional mental health conditions, anxiety or eating disorders or dissociative disorders or depression. You have those, and then kind of on top of those or alongside those, you have the personality disorder kinds of features. So personality disorder has to do with people's personality. So what is personality? You can't understand personality disorders unless you understand and think about personality. Where all of us know what personality is. Personality is that term we use that describes our real unique self. All of us have a personality. Now, occasionally we say, well, the problem with that guy, he has no personality at all. Now, we all have some level of personality because all of us are unique. Our personality is those characteristics and those traits that are unique to us that make us distinct. It's a part of how the term personality just means the distinct nature of a person. It's who we really are as people. Um, it's reflected. Our personality is reflected all kinds of ways. How we think and how we look at the world, how we naturally respond, our typical reactions. We use terms like social, or someone who's kind of shy or bashful, or someone who's kind of outgoing. We use terms like serious or funny, or kind of controlling or kind of easy going. All those are terms that we use to describe personality. I put in your lecture notes, this good personality question. If I were to go and find the people who know you the most, the best, or you were to go find people who know me the best, if you were to go find 5 or 10 people who know me well and you were to say to them, what words would you use to describe Glenn? What words would you use to describe Glenn as a person? The words they use are going to be words that describe my personality. When you ask someone that question, how would you describe, who is he as a person? The words they use, well, he's real easygoing, he's real whatever, blank, 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 whatever those blanks are, that is your personality. That's my personality, right? So that is personality. So what is a personality disorder? Well, a personality disorder is basically where the unique characteristic and traits of my personality are, number one, either they are outside the realm of typical or average. I hate to use the word normal, but kind of normal, right? There's a wide range of personality. But we kind of live in a world today where there's this broad idea of normal and accepted and appropriate. And people sometimes, most people fall into that category where our unique personality is kind of unique, but it kind of fits. It kind of fits with our culture. It fits with our society. It fits with healthy. It fits with typical. It fits with average or expected generally, right? So personality disorder is where the characteristic and traits of someone's personality, unique personality, is outside the realm of typical, outside the realm of expected or normal or healthy or whatever it may be. That's the first thing. The second thing is that those traits, those unique traits that make me unique as a person, are those traits, do they create or cause disruption in my life? And so the idea is that our unique personality, my unique personality traits are oftentimes a strength for me, but they can also be a weakness for me as well too. The fact that I'm real organized, the fact that I'm real funny, the fact that I'm real social, in some ways probably works well for me. But there are always cases where sometimes being kind of real sociable isn't always a good thing for us. So that's true for all of us. But in some cases, the unique aspects or traits or characteristics of a person, their traits are so negative or disruptive or strong or unusual that it creates a disruption and dysfunction for them. So in a way, it's almost like their personality becomes kind of dysfunctional for them. So those two things, that's what a personality disorder is. It's got the word disorder in it, right? So this idea that there are times and there are people in our world that they're unique who they are as people, their unique characteristics and traits are either outside the realm of typical, expected, normal, or healthy, and are disruptive or dysfunctional. I give you in your notes 4 key features. There are 10 different personality disorders, which we're going to review together, and I want you to get used to looking at in this module. But there are 4 key features and then 5 other key ideas I give you. Is like 9 total. But let me give you 4 key. Here are 4 key features that are true for all 10 of the personality disorders. All 10 of the different personality disorders have a lot of overlap in them. But here are 4 key features. Number one, the issue of complexity. So personality disorders, as a general rule of thumb, are complicated and multi-layered. So personality disorders are, for example, from a mental health and clinical standpoint, are complex. When I was working in clinical work, I would never make a diagnosis of a personality disorder after like one visit. You want to give yourself some time to work with people and get to know people well and to kind of see their whole picture. So personality disorders are complex because we are complex. Our personalities are complex and complicated. And so they're complex, multifaceted disorders. They're complex because, again, there's often overlap. If we were in the classroom today and we were talking about personality disorders, and I had the whiteboard behind me, there are 10 different personality disorders. I would draw on the board 10 big circles that overlap. So these 10 big, right? So 10 circles that kind of overlap. And part of why I would do that would be to highlight that even though there are 10 distinct personality disorders, there's lots of overlap between us. It's another thing that makes them complex, is just the overlap that we see between these different personality kinds of disorders. They're complex because oftentimes people who have personality disorder traits or symptoms of a personality disorder, they oftentimes too are abusing substances. They have a substance use disorder. They have bipolar disorder, or they have generalized anxiety disorder, or they have post-traumatic. So they may have multiple. They may have mental health conditions, other mental health conditions, in addition to a personality disorder, and that makes it complex. So number one key idea is that they are complex. Number two is the idea of inflexible or stable or chronic. A personality disorder is diagnosed when we see symptoms that are just chronic and stable. They are inflexible. They're basically kind of like always there. Now, here's what's true for you and me as people. Most of us, even though we have this thing called personality, most of us can modify that personality to fit whatever situation we're in. So I get up and teach in front of classes every day, but I'm kind of a quiet person. I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm kind of an easygoing, shy, quiet person. That's my nature. That's my personality. But I love to teach. And so what I do when I get in front of a classroom is I have to modify my natural personality to be more outgoing. Now that's not hard to do, but you do that too. If you're real sociable and talkative and you like to have a lot of fun, well, you probably realize that you can't always do that. When you go to work, you can't always have fun. You have to kind of modify your personality a little bit in order to fit. And so even so most of us as healthy average people, we are able to modify and adapt our personality to fit certain situations appropriately. Somebody with a personality disorder can't do has a hard time doing that. It's difficult for them to adapt their person. It's one of the characteristics we look for. Is this does this person have the capacity? Do they have the ability? Are they able to modify appropriately who they are and their personality to fit with appropriate situations? People with personality disorder characteristics struggle with that. It's hard for them to modulate, we would say, or modify their personality character. Most of us can do that. People with personality disorder traits have a hard time because the personality characteristics, which are unhealthy, are stable. They're inflexible. They're rigid. They're chronic. They're kind of always there and they're hard for the person to modify. That's a second thing. Complexity, the idea of stable, inflexible, or chronic. And then this idea was called ego-systonic and ego-dystonic. It's fancy terms that the DSM uses that I want to give to you. So here's the thing. Most of us as people, most of us as individuals, although we have blind spots in our lives, there are things in our lives that it's hard for us to see. Most of us have what's called self-awareness and insight. We have a normal, healthy, appropriate level of self-awareness or insight. We have the ability to look inside ourselves and understand who we are, how are we thinking, what are we doing. We can see ourselves somewhat clearly. If I were to ask you today, hey, list for me two or three things that you're really strong at, but list for me two or three things where you really struggle. What are some problem areas for you in your life? Most of us can do that. It might not be easy, but most of us can say, well, I'm kind of good here, good. But you know what? Here's some areas I struggle in. One of the core characteristics of a personality disorder is people lack the ability or there's low insight. They have a hard time looking inside themselves. Now, that's complicated as far as why that is. But one of the things I can speak from experience as a counselor that through the years and working with people, people are at all different levels of insight. And the issue with me is not the fact that someone has low insight. But I get more concerned when it's not low insight. It's almost like an inability for insight, almost like there's something missing cognitively where a person cannot look inside themselves. General rule of thumb, oftentimes with personality disorders, is people cannot see what everyone else can see. They think they're healthy, even though they have multiple issues and multiple problems and they have multiple disruptions in their lives. They think that's normal. They think they're normal. They think you're crazy. They think the world is crazy. It's not me, even though I have all these issues and people can easily see those issues. People with personality disorders oftentimes have low or little insight. Now, I want to say something really, this is very, very important. I put this in your lecture notes. That is different from denial. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Sometimes you and I can be in denial about something. And denial means I can look at something in my life, I just am not going to. I refuse to. I can, but I won't. That's denial. And all of us at times, maybe we are in denial about things, right? We can look inside ourselves. We can acknowledge we have a problem. We just aren't going to. We choose not to. That's denial. With personality disorders, it's almost as if people are not able to, if that makes sense. I it's not that I won't, it's that I can't. It's not that I won't look inside myself, it's as if I can't, an inability to. So people sometimes say, well, he's just in denial. Well, a lot of people are in denial, but some people, it's not denial. You start working with them and talking to them, and you realize, you know what, it's almost like they can't. It's almost like they don't even have the ability to look inside themselves. And we see that historically with personality disorder types of struggles. So lack of insight, the fancy term we use is the term egosyntonic, is just a fancy term. Ego dystonic just means that people have the capacity for insight. Personality disorders historically are egosyntonic. Last thing is just this idea of just excessive and disruptive. So personality disorders, a key idea is, again, these are personality traits that are excessive and disruptive. As we study the personality disorders in the next video, and if you look at your lecture notes, there may be times where you're like, well, I'm kind of like that sometimes. That's probably true remember the mirror effect we talked about back in module 1? That's probably true for all of us. All of us can study these 10 different personality disorders. And my hunch is all of us could say, well, I'm a little bit like that sometimes too. And there's nothing wrong with that, because that's true. That's true for depression and anxiety, other things too, right? We've talked about that this semester. But personality disorders are really, the key word is the word excessive. The key word is the word disruptive. We're not just sort of like as we've talked about all semester. We're not just talking about like your typical struggle with perfectionism or your typical struggle with social anxiousness. We're talking about like excessive and disruptive. All of the personality disorders have that feature. This idea that these personality traits of each one, they are present excessively and at a level to where they are disruptive. Because again, these are called personality disorders. The word disorder is important. The word disorder means needs help, needs treatment, means it is excessive and is disruptive. So those 4 key ideas, they're complex, the idea of complexity, the idea of inflexibility, the idea of lack of insight, and the idea of excessive and disruptive. And then lastly, just real quickly on this video before we move on to something else, I also highlight for you, in addition to those 4, here are just 5. I always give you these key ideas to think about with these different disorders. Here are 5 additional key ideas I want to summarize for you really quickly. Number one of the things that makes personality disorders complex is we don't always know what causes them. We don't always know what causes them. We believe that most personality disorders, like most mental health conditions, are probably caused by a unique, complex interaction and combination of both biochemical and personal and environmental factors. We don't always know why people struggle with personality disorders. Sometimes trauma comes into play, especially like with borderline personality disorder. Sometimes with antisocial personality disorder, role modeling and environment can come into play. But in most instances, we don't always know. We're not always sure. We do think it's a complex combination interaction of both individual factors, environmental factors, including upbringing, and then also biochemical, number 1. Number 2, again, I mentioned this before, part of what makes these disorders complex is many people with personality disorders also too abuse substances or they may battle other mental health kinds of conditions. Interestingly, these are adult-only disorders. The third idea is that these are adult-only disorders. We do not diagnose personality disorders in anyone prior to their 18th birthday. And sometimes some professionals go even like to the 21st birthday. So these are adult-only disorders. We do not diagnose personality disorders in children or in adolescents. That's a key idea. Like most mental health conditions, we usually begin to see the symptoms of a personality disorder in late adolescence and early adulthood. And then this idea of being treatable for many, many years. I'm going to give you a little bit of an example of how things have changed. When I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this video about me being in graduate school. When I was in graduate school, I kind of was taught, sort of, that personality disorders are not treatable. You can't really counsel somebody who has avoidant person. You can't really counsel someone effectively who has antisocial. They're not going to respond because they don't think they have a problem. And there's no medicine for it. These are lifelong, chronic, personality problems that someone's going to always have. That's just the way it is. Well, we've sort of changed our attitude a little bit. And today we realize that actually, even people with personality disorders, can learn how to identify and look inside themselves and kind of increase their level of insight, and then learn how to make different choices and behaviors and those kinds of things, understand who they are and make different decisions. So they are treatable. Today we believe absolutely they are treatable. There are certain kind of counseling approaches like motivational interviewing and dialectical behavior therapy and cognitive behavior therapy that tend to be really, really good with working with people who have some of the features of these personality disorders. So those 5 key ideas are also important with the other 4. So I want you to come back and look at the next video. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the 3 clusters, A, B, and C, the 3 clusters of personality disorders, cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. So come back, look at your lecture notes, look at all the stuff I've got loaded for you in the module, and I'll see you in the next video.